tomatoes, if you get to know the people at the local fruit stands, if you say, I want a box of seconds or the really ripe tomatoes, they'll set aside a case, like a banker's box of tomatoes, and I've been getting them for $6 to $8 of the seconds. Now you have to be careful when you're going through them, and you can cut out the bad spots and make sure that they're good, but that's a good way to get some as well. So once you have the tomatoes, I kind of just brush off any dirt that I see. They don't have to be perfectly clean, although later in the process we want to make sure everything is really sterile, so that you're very careful when you're preserving that what you're doing when you're actually putting it into the jars. It's a sterile process. But the first thing I do is I take a big pot and I boil water in it. So about half full, I'll get this boiling, and then I'll put the tomatoes in a handful at a time. So I would probably put all of these in one batch. And I let them boil for about a minute or two, and you will start to see them split. The skins will split, and as soon as you see the skin split, that they're done in that water. So then I have a bowl like this filled with ice water. So I just put ice water in that, and I'll scoop these out of here, and I will dunk them in the ice water. And that cools them down so you can handle them, and it also contracts the skin, and they almost peel themselves. They're pretty easy. So when we do this with a couple people, there's usually one person at the stove, like keeping the tomatoes going and kind of blanching the tomatoes and getting it so the skins come off really easily. And all these tomato products, except for that, which is not tomato, you start by taking the skins off. If you don't take the skins off, they tend to roll up real tight, and they're tough, and they're really kind of inedible. So the skins come off of just about anything that we do. Another way to do it is if you're making tomato sauce. My mom used to make sauce and then put it in a food mill, and if you grind the tomatoes in a food mill, the skins will stay, and you kind of can avoid that peeling, but it goes pretty fast. So once they're off there, we're going to pretend that this is split and it's going to be easy to peel. So I usually just cut the end off, and any dark spots, even some, this one's pretty far gone, but if it just had like one spot like that, I would still use that and just cut that off. And my mom always used the smell test. You can kind of smell tomatoes if they smell like, you know, they've gone or a bad spot's infected it. So if you cut the end off and this is peeled, you can almost squeeze it like this and the skins come right off. So then it goes into whatever you're doing. The easiest thing is just jarred tomatoes, which is this. You see these here. These are whole tomatoes, and they make great stewed tomatoes in the winter. We actually eat those just out of the jar with salt and pepper, and I'm going to let you taste those a little bit and compare it to a grocery store tomato. There's really no comparison. So when you're getting ready to actually jar, all summer long, Mom used to keep the top rack of the dishwasher full of jars. Whenever she did dishes, she'd throw a couple extra jars in. So she always had 8 or 10 sterilized jars. In the dishwasher, it works fine. If you don't have a dishwasher, you can sterilize them in a pot of boiling water, and you just need to be careful how you handle them. There's a real handy thing called a jar lifter. You can do it without this, but if you're going to really do this, I would seriously invest in a little jar lifter, because these are made to fit around the top of these. You're dealing with boiling water, and you really, it can be kind of dangerous. So your jars are sterilized. After I take them out of the dishwasher, I always set up a clean part of the counter with a clean white dishcloth. And I set them all there until I'm ready to use. So this is a sterile jar. I have my tomato. I cut the ends off. On the bigger ones, especially the real big ones, cut the core out. So you cut around the core, and then the skins slip off. And then you start packing them in here. You know, these are, use your imagination. And then you literally take it and kind of squish it down with your hands, and you look for any air bubbles in there. So you get the air bubbles out. So you take a knife and you kind of squeeze around the end so that you don't have air bubbles in tomatoes. Now your jar lids, I never reuse this part. Once I use it once, I throw it away. Some people can, and you can, if it's not damaged, use it more than once, but these are pretty inexpensive to buy by itself. You can buy them without the rings. The rings you can reuse, because they just kind of hold it in place. But you can get a pack of these pretty cheaply. Food Lion sells them, and I usually just buy them by the box. So before you put these on top of the jar, these also need to be sterile. So they go to a water bath. I have a different pot on the stove, and I just put all my jars and lids in there, and I take a pair of tongs and get them out of the boiling water. If you bring them to a boil, leave them boil for about 5 minutes, then these are sterile. So when you lift those out, you've got these in here. You want to make sure there's liquid filled up to right about this bottom ring. You need about a 1/2 inch of airspace, but you need no air below that. So you want a 1/2 inch of airspace above it, which would look like that. Almost all this summer, the tomatoes have enough natural water in them that they don't have to add. But if you're short, you can add either tomato juice or water just to fill up to that line. But I really didn't have to, just by compressing the tomatoes. Take a clean towel. I always just use a clean towel or a white bleached dish towel. And after you put the tomatoes in, you wipe around the edge, make sure there's nothing on that edge. You're going to put your lid on. What? I forgot something. And I didn't bring it. That's why I forgot it. Salt. Always add. It helps in the preserving, and it does help in the flavor of tomatoes. So about a 1/2 teaspoon of salt goes in each one. There is a canning salt that has nothing else in it. No anti-caking, no iodine, no extra. But I'll use kosher salt too. It really doesn't matter. But about a 1/2 teaspoon of salt goes in the top of each jar when the tomatoes are the only thing in there. And you put this lid on, and then you put this on just till it's snug. It doesn't really have to be too tight. You don't have to worry about that because you can tighten it more later. So then that's ready to be processed. And you wait until you have a whole batch. Now, I do have a canner, and this was Mom's. So you can use a canner like this, which has space for every jar. And if you look at this, you can put it in there like this. You also can use a heavy bottom pan. I can actually fit more in here. And I use this, like some people say not to do this, and Mom did it. I didn't have one that didn't seal this year. But this has a real heavy bottom, and I just put them all in here. So
with the rack?
No, not with the rack, just right on the bottom. And I've never had a problem. As long as you're actually using, the ball jars or the curd jars, mason jars, I would not recommend reusing mayonnaise jars. The lids fit. I mean, I don't even know if they sell mayonnaise in glass jars anymore. They used to, right? They're plastic now. But there are jars that these lids will fit. But if they're not the canning jars, the glass hasn't been tempered to use like that, and so they will break. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than when you made a big spot of spaghetti sauce, it was cooking all day, and to have it bust in there and your water's all red, and it breaks your heart. It's not worth it. Just make sure, and you can reuse these over and over and over again. Look for them at yard sales, because there are a lot of people getting rid of grandma's canning stuff, and just buy the jars and you can use them forever.
Do you have to have the jars hot when you put your ingredients in?
I don't. I don't. Like I said, this year I didn't have one that didn't seal. And I left a canning magazine out here. Yes. There are recipes in here. A lot of them say that for tomato products you add lemon juice. Mom never did it. I've never done it. I don't know that it would change the flavor. But tomatoes are acid enough. I think just the tomatoes and salt. And I've never had them go bad. So now that you get your jars in here, either in the canner or in the big pot like that, if what you're putting in there is hot, then you want to add hot water. What you don't want to do is mix cold with hot or hot with cold, because that could crack the jar. So if you have hot spaghetti sauce, then you want to fill the pot with hot water. If you have cold tomatoes, fill it with room temperature water. and you need to fill it to an inch above the lid. So these are just pints. Sometimes I'll do quarts. So you need to make sure if you're doing quarts that you have room in your pot to boil and have at least an inch of water over it. So an inch is about my knuckle. So I always, if it's not boiling hot water, I just stick my finger in there, and when I get up to that first joint, that's an inch. So you want to make sure everything is covered. So I try to process the same size jars at the same time. Sometimes I use the little jars. Is that like the salsa?
Like
Yeah.
a jelly jar.
So sometimes I'll use the jelly jars, and I'll try to do a whole batch. You can mix them, and then you kind of have to work on the times, process it for the biggest jar. So when I say process, that's how long you boil this for. You have to bring this pot up to a boil. And that can take a good 15 minutes in and of itself. But you don't start timing your processing time until you come to that boil. So if you started with hot product, like hot sauce and hot water, is going to take less time, but you start at the boiling time. And whenever you read any canning magazine or recipe, it'll tell you process the jars for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, a half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever that is, you time it from the boil. So once it comes to a boil, for this size jar and just regular tomatoes, 15 to 20 minutes is fine. It's really all I've ever done for tomatoes like that. Because it's really like a fresh tomato product, and you want it to taste like fresh tomato when it comes out of that jar. So once the timer's gone off and you've had the timer in there, this is really, really hot. That's why you have to be careful. You're gonna lift them out with this. I set them right back on that white towel on top of my counter just to protect the countertop. And I just set them out there. And usually within a half an hour, you start hearing a pop, pop, pop. And that's what you need to make sure. And sometimes it says it can take overnight. If it's hot in your house and everything's hot, it could take a little longer for that temperature change to suck a vacuum. What it's actually doing now is sucking a vacuum in that jar. So once they all pop, they're sealed. I always mark them with the year, because you never know how some stuff, like this one, this says tomatoes 10. That was done 2 years ago. This jar of tomatoes, it got lost on my shelf, I guess, because usually I use all of them.
But how long will they last?
You know, it really depends. Some things will actually just, the flavor will deteriorate. If you still have a seal, I think it's relatively safe, but I try not to go more than 3 or 4 years on it. You know, usually we use it up. That's why I said the jelly. I have some jelly that probably my mom did, and I can't bear to chuck it, but we just don't use that much jelly. So I always label them, and then I try to rotate my stock. And then, you know, I don't need to do so many tomatoes next year. I don't need to do so many, whatever. So that's basic tomatoes. I'll talk a little bit about the other stuff. But they're easy, and they go fast. I mean, don't they, Martha? Probably in an hour, we can take a banker's box of tomatoes is considered a half a bushel. So like I have a recipe for tomato sauce that calls for a half a bushel or a bushel of tomatoes. But just to can them in jars, in an hour, I can can that whole, you know, get them on the stove and cook it in an hour, which is not that long. I mean, I can do it on a weeknight after work. The other stuff takes a little longer. So if I was going to do the tomato sauce, which if anybody wants this recipe, I'd be happy to give it to you. It's my mom's recipe. We've altered a little bit because she used to have a cup of sugar in it. I took the sugar out, and I don't think it suffered for that. But it's a wonderful, fresh tomato sauce. This probably takes the longest because you have to make the sauce first. So it's like a box of those tomatoes, and you peel them, and I use this pan. So they're all in that pan. There's onions, a little jalapeno pepper in there. I put fresh basil in it. There is tomato paste. You need a couple cans of tomato paste to thicken it. Salt. That's about it. Garlic. That's about it. It's pretty basic sauce. But you have to simmer that. When you're making any of those tomato products, that and the salsa, which we open the jar of salsa, you need to get some of the water off. So one of my favorite kind of byproducts is the tomato juice. So if I'm making that sauce, when I first do the tomatoes, I will take a slotted spoon and then like a cup and push that slotted spoon or a strainer down in the juice and just ladle off some of the sauce. It makes the process go quicker because your sauce will thicken up. And when I'm making the salsa, I do the same thing for the salsa, but I get spicy tomato juice, like a spicy V8. Oh, it's really good. Love that. So I don't waste anything. And then I do the same thing with that juice I've ladled off, put it in the jars, you know, leave a 1/2 inch air space, and I process that too. So the spaghetti sauce you make just like you were making fresh spaghetti sauce, but then you put it in the jars with a 1/2 inch air space and process it the same as the tomatoes. The salsa, which is over there, this time of year is perfect for that. You can see in this garden here, who's going to eat all these jalapenos, you know?
Yeah.
You wind up with an abundance of these things. So you take, and you don't even have to do a full box. You take whatever you have. Tomatoes, onions, hot peppers, and I always like a little fresh cilantro in mine, but you can leave that out if you don't like cilantro. And salt. That's it. Put that in there. You don't really cook it long because you don't want it to turn into sauce. And you leave it kind of chunky. And I just ladle off that juice, put that in a separate jar to can, and then what I'll do is I'll take the slotted spoon, and so once I have all the chopped vegetables in there, the tomatoes and peppers, I'll scoop it out like this. This is where this comes in handy. This little thing fits in the top of all these, just like this. So it keeps it from getting all over the edge. And so then I'll scoop it out without too much juice, and I'll put it in there. So then what's left in the bottom is just the juice that I can jar separately.
Nancy,
Yes.
how many jalapenos do you?
That is, you know, Mom used to have a recipe for things like that. Jalapenos are the strangest peppers, and they vary from season to season and plant to plant. So it is entirely a taste thing. What I will tell you is, me personally, I like to start off a little on the hot side because when you're done processing and cooking, it mellows it. So it should have a bit of a kick when you're ready to put it in the jar, because after you jar it and it sits there, it's going to mellow out some. And so a lot of times it's not hot at all, and I have some family members that prefer it that way.
Yeah.
And I have some that like it spicy.
Yeah.
So I always start off a little on the spicy side, but you almost have to taste it. There's almost no way for me to tell you 8 jalapenos per box of tomatoes.
You don't.
I don't think I heard you say you don't put any lime juice or anything like that.
I don't.
I normally put that into a fresh salsa.
Yeah.
Do you think that would compromise it because of the acid?
No, and actually, if you read a lot of these recipes, they tell you to put lemon juice or lime juice in the tomato products. They want it acid. The more acid you have, the less likely bacteria will grow. So yeah, I just never did it that way. The other thing I use this for a lot is over the top of a meatloaf. So when I make meatloaf, I'll put a jar of that salsa over the top when I bake it.
And that one is perfect for me because I don't
Is
like
it?
it too hot either.
But I
so
can't
it's
tell
one of-
you what I did.
Yeah.
It's a taste thing, and because they have different heats,
Yeah.
and different peppers have different heat. You've got 2 different kinds right here.
Right.
I mean, and that's enough to make like a nice batch. Go find yourself a box of tomatoes, and we'll get to it. I don't think I have anything else. The only thing I was just going to let you do is just to prove my point. So I went to the grocery store this morning, and against my religion, I bought a grocery store tomato.
Yeah. Oh, let us try it.
And this jar is from 2010, so let's just see what happens after 2 years, what it tastes like.
I used to can. I make jam.
Ah,
I go through tomatoes and stuff.
I had.
And there's spoons.
Yeah.
I have done it. My mother-in-law used to do it. She used to
A little bit.
She used to make tomato juice. Oh, she used the whole tomato. Put it through the cake mix. It was like a little bit thicker.
Even the color.
Yeah.
I know. You know, you really.
I've got a bunch of tomatoes and potatoes in the car.
You have spoons there if you want.
I do. I have a little bit of everything. But I mean, we just eat them out of the jar like this. Yeah. So there you go. You can try the difference.
Not for you.
But it's like people are like, I can't believe, you know,
So, Ann,
tomatoes
what-
are only $2 a can in the grocery store. And I'm like, I know, but they're, you know.
So what's the verdict?
What's the verdict? 2-year-old canned tomatoes
2-year-old canned
Candy.
tomatoes.
versus
Oh.
a fresh
Cardboard.
tomato from the grocery store.
This is really and I love the idea of the
Wonderful.
spicy juice for Bloody Marys
Love that.
or whatever.
I had it for breakfast with my eggs.
Yeah.
I love the left. That's my favorite part is the
Awesome.
leftover
I never
juice.
thought of that. Never thought of that.
So I can't sell these
No, thank you
cardboard
very
tomatoes.
Yeah, we know what that tastes like.
Yeah.
We like the visual though.
It does have salt, but no
Okay.
sugar.
So
I don't
these
put
are
sugar
the
in anything
cardboard.
anymore.
And
I don't
where
think you
are
need it
the
if
others?
tomatoes are
Oh,
fine right there.
this?
I'll take the trash
Did
here.
you say, is
Oh,
there a
this-
difference in the
right here.
kind of
It's this
tomatoes
one.
you use?
You know, I use
No, it's right here.
just
No,
about
this
any
is the
kind.
2012.
I use whatever's right. Now,
Oh,
when
no, you're
using
right. It's that.
These have a lot less water in them. So
There's
they definitely
these
do
cups up
make
there.
up better when you're making sauce because you're going to reduce that down till it's thick enough for sauce. So it's nice to be able to do these. And people are like, oh, you have to peel this. These peel so easy. You cut the end off and you like squirt them out. It goes fast. It's not hard at all. It's not like you're peeling all these little things. It goes really fast. But you can't find these by the case at any place around here. I found them one time in New Jersey. So that's why this year I had to. But
I'm a Jersey girl.
I had to expand my tomato garden this year and planted 80 tomato plants so I could get these. But I never could get a whole box of these at one time, even with 80 tomato plants. So I mix them all. You know. That's pretty much it.
They're great.
Hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you so much, Nancy.